The folder was already on the table when I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the HR director sitting across from it. Not my manager standing near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. The folder. Cream-colored, Hartwell Group letterhead, sitting in the center of the conference table like it had been placed there with intention. It had been. The room was called Birchwood. 4th floor, east side of the building, the one with the frosted glass panel on the door so people in the hallway could see shapes, but not faces. I had been in Birchwood before. I had delivered findings in Birchwood. I had sat across from auditors in Birchwood and walked them through documentation that I had spent weeks preparing. I had never been the subject of a Birchwood meeting. Until that Thursday. The HR director's name was Colleen Marsh. She was professional, careful, the kind of person who delivers bad news with a neutral expression because she has delivered it enough times that the expression is now structural. She said, "Miriam, thank you for coming in. Please sit down." I sat. She slid the folder toward me. "We're making some changes to the compliance leadership structure," she said. "Your position has been eliminated, effective today." I looked at the folder. "There's a separation agreement inside," she said. 2 weeks of severance for each year of service, up to a maximum of 4 weeks. "We'd ask that you sign by Friday." I looked up. "Friday," I said. "End of business," she said. I looked at the folder again. I did not open it. Not yet. My name is Miriam Okafor. I am 46 years old, and for 13 years I was the Director of Compliance at Hartwell Group, a mid-sized healthcare billing and revenue cycle management company based in Atlanta, Georgia. We processed medical billing for hospital systems, outpatient clinics, and specialty practices across 7 states. At our peak, we were processing $340 million in annual claims. I built the compliance infrastructure from the ground up. When I arrived, Hartwell had a compliance manual that was 11 pages long and had not been updated since 2009. I replaced it with a living framework, the Hartwell Compliance Operating System, which sounds more impressive than it is, but what it meant in practice was that every billing code, every claim submission, every audit trail had a documented process behind it. It meant that when a payer questioned a claim, we had the paper to back it up. It meant that when a federal auditor walked in, I could hand them a binder and watch them relax. That system prevented an estimated $6.2 million in billing errors and rejected claims in its first 3 years alone. I also built the Hartwell Audit Response Protocol, which was the internal process for responding to external audits without creating new liability in the process of answering questions. Healthcare billing audits are the kind of thing that can turn a minor documentation gap into a federal investigation if you answer the wrong question the wrong way. My protocol made sure we answered correctly. In 13 years, Hartwell had 0 successful regulatory actions against it. 0. I also trained every compliance analyst who came through the department. 7 people over 13 years. 3 of them were promoted to senior roles. 1 left to run compliance at a larger firm in Nashville and sent me a handwritten note when she got the job. I missed my father's retirement party in 2019 because a payer audit request came in on a Friday afternoon with a Monday deadline, and I was the only person who knew where every document lived. My father understood. He said, "You'll make it up to me." I said I would. I did not make it up to him before he passed in 2021. I think about that sometimes. Not with regret, exactly. With clarity. The folder on the table in Birchwood was the return on that investment. 4 weeks of severance. 13 years. I left the folder on the table and went back to my office. His name was Trevor Ashby. He was 34 years old, the son of Hartwell Group's founder, Richard Ashby, who had stepped back from day-to-day operations in 2021 and handed the CEO role to an outside hire named Dennis Pratt. Dennis Pratt lasted 18 months. When he left, Richard Ashby did not hire another outside CEO. He promoted Trevor. Trevor had been at Hartwell for 3 years. Before that, he had worked at a private equity firm in Charlotte for 2 years, which is the kind of background that teaches you to talk about EBITDA and operational leverage without necessarily understanding what either of those things requires in practice. He wore suits that were expensive and slightly too large in the shoulders, which is a specific kind of expensive that happens when someone buys the brand without getting the fitting. He called the compliance department the risk mitigation vertical. I said, once, we're the compliance department. He said, right, the risk mitigation vertical. Same thing. It was not the same thing. Trevor had been COO for 8 months before his father made him CEO. In those 8 months, he had restructured the sales team, rebranded the company's client portal, and introduced a new billing optimization initiative that he described in an all-hands meeting as a revenue acceleration framework. I had questions about the revenue acceleration framework. Specifically, I had questions about a billing practice that had appeared in the Q3 claims data, a pattern of upcoding on outpatient procedure claims for 3 specific client accounts. Upcoding is when you bill for a more expensive procedure than the one that was actually performed. It is not a gray area. It is fraud. The pattern was not large. Not yet. It was $340,000 across 3 accounts over 1 quarter. But patterns in billing data do not stay small. They grow, because the people running them assume that if it worked once, it will work again. I flagged it in writing on October 14th. I sent the memo to Trevor, to the CFO, and to the general counsel. Trevor called me into his office the following morning. His office was on the 5th floor, corner room, a view of Peachtree Street that his father had occupied for 20 years. He had replaced the furniture with something more modern, which is fine, and removed the framed photos of the company's founding team, which I found instructive. He said, I read your memo. I said, good. He said, I think you're misreading the data. I said, I'm not. He leaned back. Miriam, the revenue acceleration framework is a legitimate optimization of our billing capture process. We're not leaving money on the table that we're entitled to. We're billing for procedures that weren't performed, I said. He looked at me. That's a significant accusation. It's a finding, I said. I've documented it. The claims data is in the memo. He said, I'd like you to take another look at the methodology before we escalate this. The methodology is standard claims analysis, I said. I've been doing it for 13 years. He said, I appreciate your diligence. Let's revisit this next week. I said, Trevor, if this pattern continues into Q4, we have a federal exposure problem. He said, I'll take it under advisement. I went back to my office. I sent a follow-up memo on October 21st. I sent another on November 3rd. On November 9th, I received a calendar invite for a meeting in Birchwood. No subject line. Just the room, the time, and the names, Colleen Marsh, Trevor Ashby. I knew what it was before I opened it. I had known since October 14th, if I am being honest. The folder was already on the table when I walked in. Colleen delivered the news. Trevor stood near the window. He did not look at me once during the meeting, which told me everything I needed to know about how comfortable he was with the decision. Colleen said, your position has been eliminated, effective today. She said, 2 weeks of severance for each year of service, up to a maximum of 4 weeks. She said, we'd ask that you sign by Friday. I said, what's in the folder? She said, a separation agreement and a non-disclosure agreement. Standard terms. I said, I'd like to review it. She said, of course. End of business Friday. I picked up the folder. I stood. Trevor was still looking at the window. I said, good luck. He did not respond. I walked out of Birchwood, down the hallway, past the open bullpen where 3 of my analysts were at their desks. Marcus, who had been with me for 4 years, looked up when I passed. He saw the folder. He saw my face. He started to say something. I shook my head once. He closed his mouth. I went to my office, packed the personal items from my desk into a canvas tote I kept in the bottom drawer for reasons I had never examined too closely, and walked to the elevator. The lobby was quiet. The security desk attendant, a man named Gerald who had worked the morning shift for 6 years and always asked about my weekend, looked up when I came through. He said, Ms. Okafor, have a good afternoon. I said, thank you, Gerald. I walked to my car. I sat in the parking garage for 3 minutes. Then I opened the folder. The separation agreement was 4 pages. Standard language mostly. Termination date, severance calculation, benefits continuation, return of company property. The NDA was 6 pages. I read it carefully. I read it the way I had been trained to read documents, not for what they said, but for what they were trying to accomplish. By page 3, I had found it. Section 4, paragraph 2, employee agrees not to disclose, report, or communicate to any third party, including but not limited to government agencies, regulatory bodies, or media organizations, any information related to the company's business practices, billing procedures, client relationships, or internal operations. Any third party, including government agencies, including regulatory bodies. I read it again. Then I took out my phone and called Patricia Wren. Not Patricia Wren. Different attorney. Her name was Diane Castillo. She was a labor and employment attorney in Atlanta who specialized in whistleblower cases and had been recommended to me by a former colleague who had needed exactly this kind of help 3 years earlier. I had saved Diane's number in February. Not because I had decided anything. Because I had been reading the billing data since January and I understood what patterns in billing data eventually become, and I believed in having a number saved before you need it rather than after. Diane answered on the 3rd ring. I said, I was terminated this morning. They've given me an NDA with a Friday deadline. I need you to look at it. She said, can you come in today? I said, I'm in the parking garage. She said, come now. Diane's office was in Midtown, 12 minutes from Hartwell's building. I was there in 11. She read the NDA in 8 minutes. I watched her face while she read it. She had the expression of someone who has seen this before and is deciding how to explain it without sounding like she is enjoying herself. She set it down. This is a whistleblower suppression clause, she said. I know. They're asking you to waive your right to report to the SEC, the OEG, and CMS. I know. In exchange for 4 weeks of severance. Yes. She looked at me. What did you flag? I told her. The upcoding pattern. The 3 accounts. The $340,000 in Q3. The memos. The dates. The meeting with Trevor. The follow-up memos. The calendar invite with no subject line. She was quiet for a moment. Do you have copies of the memos? Yes. Where? Personal email. I forwarded them to myself on October 14th, October 21st, and November 3rd. She looked at me. Before the termination. Yes. You forwarded compliance findings to your personal email before you were fired. I forward documentation to my personal email when I believe it may be relevant to a future proceeding, I said. I have done that for 13 years. It is in my personal work practice documentation, which I also have. Diane was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Miriam, this NDA is unenforceable. I know. Federal whistleblower protections under Dodd-Frank and the False Claims Act explicitly prohibit employers from using NDAs to prevent employees from reporting to the SEC or other federal agencies. This clause is not just aggressive, it's illegal. I know, I said. They may not know you know that. No, I said. They probably don't. She leaned forward. What do you want to do? I had thought about this in the parking garage. 3 minutes is enough time to think clearly if you have been thinking about something for 10 months. I want to file a complaint with the SEC, I said. And I want to respond to the NDA in writing, through you, so that Hartwell Group understands that I am aware of the enforceability problem. Diane said, if you file with the SEC and the investigation finds what you found, you're eligible for a whistleblower award. 10 to 30% of sanctions over $1 million. I said, I know. She said, the Q3 number was $340,000. For 1 quarter, I said. The pattern started in Q2. And I have reason to believe it continued into Q4. She looked at the folder. How much reason? Enough to have documented it, I said. She picked up her pen. Let's start from the beginning, she said. We filed the SEC complaint on November 15th. 6 days after I walked out of Birchwood with a folder and a Friday deadline. The complaint was detailed, specific, and supported by the 3 memos, the claims data I had documented in my personal files, and a timeline of events that began in January when I first noticed the pattern and ended on November 9th when I was handed a non-disclosure agreement in a conference room with frosted glass. Diane sent a letter to Hartwell's general counsel on November 12th, 3 days before the SEC filing. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that I had received the separation agreement and NDA. The second paragraph cited the specific federal statutes that made Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the NDA unenforceable. The third paragraph stated that I would not be signing the NDA in its current form. The fourth paragraph said that I was preserving all rights available to me under applicable law. It did not mention the SEC. It did not need to. Colleen Marsh called me on Thursday afternoon, one day before the Friday deadline. She said, "Miriam, we received the letter from your attorney." I said, "Good." She said, "We'd like to discuss the terms." I said, "My attorney handles the terms." She said, "Of course. I just wanted to reach out personally and say that we value the work you've done here and we hope we can find a resolution that works for everyone." I said, "Diane Castillo's number is on the letterhead." Colleen said, "Right? Yes. We'll be in touch with her." I said, "Good." I ended the call. Diane called me 20 minutes later. "Hartwell's general counsel just called," she said. "I know. They want to revise the NDA." "Of course they do. They're offering 6 weeks of severance instead of 4. I said, "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd relay the offer." And I'm relaying it," she said. "What do you want to do?" I said, "We already filed." She said, "I know." "Then the offer doesn't change anything." She said, "That's what I thought you'd say." The SEC acknowledged receipt of the complaint on November 18th. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the confirmation came through. My husband, James, was making coffee. He had been making coffee at the kitchen table every morning for 19 years, which is the kind of detail you notice when everything else is in motion. He set a cup in front of me. He said, "Anything." I showed him the screen. He read it. He said, "Good." That was it. That was enough. The investigation moved faster than I expected, which Diane said was unusual, but not unprecedented when the documentation was clean and the pattern was clear. By December, the SEC had issued a formal inquiry to Hartwell Group. By January, the scope of the investigation had expanded. What I had found in Q3, $340,000 across 3 accounts, was the visible part. The investigators found the rest. The pattern had started in Q1, not Q2. It had expanded to 11 client accounts by Q4. The total fraudulent billing across the full period was $4.1 million. Trevor Ashby had approved the Revenue Acceleration Framework in writing. In writing, there is a specific kind of person who commits fraud in writing because they believe the writing will never be seen. Trevor was that kind of person. He had sent emails. He had approved memos. He had responded to my October 14th flag with a written reply that said, in part, "The billing optimization methodology has been reviewed and approved at the executive level." Approved at the executive level. By him. Marcus called me in January. He said, "Lena, sorry, Miriam. Sorry. It's Marcus." I said, "I know who it is." He said, "The SEC people were here today. In the building. They took boxes." I said, "I know." He said, "Trevor's been in his office with the door closed since 9 this morning." I said, "Marcus." "Yeah. Are you okay?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm fine," he said. I wanted you to know. In case you didn't." "I knew," I said. He said, "Did you know they'd find all of it?" I said, "I knew what I found. I didn't know what else was there." He said, "There was a lot else." "I know that now." He said, "Miriam, what you did. Flagging it. The memos. All of it." I said, "It was my job." He said, "Nobody else would have done it." I said, "Someone would have eventually." He said, "Maybe. But you did it first." I did not answer that. Because he was right, and I did not need to say so. The investigation was ongoing. The boxes were in federal hands. Trevor Ashby was in his office with the door closed. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at the SEC's Atlanta regional office, there was a complaint with my name on it, dated November 15th, 6 days after I had walked out of Birchwood with a folder and a Friday deadline. I had not signed the NDA. I had not taken the 4 weeks. I had called Diane Castillo from a parking garage and driven to Midtown in 11 minutes. And now the people who had handed me that folder were learning something that I had understood since October 14th. Compliance directors do not flag things because they are required to. They flag things because they know what happens when nobody does. And I had been doing this for 13 years. The boxes left Hartwell's building on a Tuesday. I know because Marcus texted me a photo. Not of the boxes, he was more careful than that. Just a text that said, 3 agents. For hours. Conference room on 5 is sealed. Conference room on 5 was Trevor's floor. I read the text, set my phone face down on my kitchen table, and finished my coffee. James looked up from his newspaper. Work, he said. Former work, I said. He nodded and went back to the paper. That was January. By the end of the second week of February, the situation at Hartwell Group had moved from a federal inquiry into something that required a different word entirely. The technical failure came first, and it came from a direction Trevor had not anticipated. When I left, the Hartwell Compliance Operating System, the framework I had built over 13 years, did not leave with me. The documentation stayed. The processes stayed. What left was the person who understood why every piece of it existed and what happened when any piece of it was skipped. Trevor had appointed an interim compliance lead. His name was Ryan Cho, 31 years old, 2 years out of a healthcare administration graduate program, and, as of November 10th, responsible for a compliance infrastructure he had not built and did not fully understand. Ryan was not incompetent. He was inexperienced, which is a different problem and in some ways a worse one, because inexperienced people do not know what they do not know. What Ryan did not know was that the Hartwell Audit Response Protocol had a quarterly trigger built into it. Every 90 days, a set of internal claim audits ran automatically, and the results had to be reviewed, flagged if necessary, and signed off by the compliance director before the next billing cycle closed. I had built that trigger in 2018 after a near miss with a payer audit that had caught us within signed review documentation. The Q4 trigger ran on February 3rd. Ryan did not know it existed. The billing cycle closed on February 7th without the sign-off. The payer, a major commercial insurer that represented $28 million of Hartwell's annual contract value, ran their own routine audit on February 11th and found the unsigned review documentation. Under the terms of the contract, and signed compliance documentation in a billing cycle was grounds for a payment hold. They issued the hold on February 14th. Valentine's Day. $28 million in contract value frozen. Marcus called me that evening. He said, the Vantage Health contract is on hold. I said, I know. He said, how do you know? I said, because the Q4 audit trigger ran on February 3rd and nobody signed the review. He was quiet. You built a trigger, he said. I built several, I said. They're all documented in the system. Ryan didn't know about it. No, I said. He wouldn't. Marcus said, Trevor is Miriam, he is not handling this well. I imagine not. He called a department heads meeting this morning and told everyone the hold was a payer relationship misalignment. I looked at my ceiling. Payer relationship misalignment, I said. Yes. The payer found in signed compliance documentation. Yes. That is not a relationship problem. I know that, Marcus said. You know that. The CFO knows that. Trevor is the only person in the room who seems to believe his own framing. That was the technical failure. The relational failure arrived through a different door, the way relational failures always do, through a person who had been patient for a long time and finally stopped being patient. Hartwell's largest client was a hospital system called Meridian Regional Health, based in Savannah. They had been with Hartwell for 7 years. Their contract was worth $41 million annually. I had personally managed the compliance relationship with their internal audit team for 6 of those 7 years. Their VP of Revenue Integrity, a woman named Carol Simmons, had my cell number and used it when something needed to move quickly. Carol had called me in October, before I was fired, with a question about a billing discrepancy on one of their orthopedic accounts. I had resolved it in 48 hours. After I left, Carol's calls went to Ryan. Ryan was responsive. He was polite. He was also, according to what Marcus told me later, unable to answer 3 consecutive questions about Meridian Regional's specific contract terms without putting Carol on hold to look things up. Carol was not a patient woman. She was a thorough one, which is different and more dangerous. In February, Meridian Regional's internal audit team flagged the same upcoding pattern that I had flagged in October. Not on their account, on a different client's claims that had been processed through the same billing workflow. They had seen it in an industry compliance bulletin that had circulated after the SEC inquiry became semi-public. Carol called Hartwell's main line and asked to speak to the compliance director. She was transferred to Ryan. Ryan told her the matter was under active review at the executive level. Carol asked what that meant. Ryan said, "We're optimizing our response framework." Carol asked when she could expect a formal written response. Ryan said, "We're targeting end of quarter." End of quarter was 6 weeks away. Carol Simmons did not wait 6 weeks. She called Hartwell's general counsel directly and informed him that Meridian Regional Health was initiating a contract review and suspending new billing submissions pending a compliance certification from an independent auditor. The contract review notification arrived on February 19th. $41 million. The general counsel called Trevor. Trevor called an emergency board meeting. The board meeting happened on February 22nd. I know what was said in it because Richard Ashby, Trevor's father, the founder, the man who had stepped back from operations in 2021, called Diane Castillo's office the following morning. Not Trevor. Richard. Diane called me immediately after. She said, "Richard Ashby wants a conversation." I said, "About what?" She said he didn't say. But he asked if you were open to discussing a return to Hartwell in a leadership capacity. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I'd relay the message." I said, "Tell him I'm open to a conversation. Through you." She said, "I already told him that." Trevor called me directly that afternoon. He had gotten my number from somewhere, which was either Colleen Marsh or his own contacts, and he used it without going through Diane, which told me something about how the board meeting had gone and how much of his composure was still intact. He said, "Miriam, it's Trevor Ashby." I said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to reach out personally. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the circumstances of your departure, and I'd like to." "Trevor," I said. He stopped. "My attorney handles these conversations," I said. He said, "I understand that, but I think a direct conversation between us could." "Diane Castillo," I said. "Her number is on the letter we sent in November." He said, "Miriam, the company is in a difficult position right now, and I think we both know that you're the person who." "Trevor." He stopped again. "I filed an SEC complaint on November 15th, I said. Everything goes through my attorney." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. I said, "Good luck." I ended the call. He called back twice. I did not answer. The financial failure, the one that moved the board from concerned to alarmed, arrived in the first week of March, and it arrived in the form of a number. The Vantage Health payment hold had been in place for 3 weeks. $28 million in contract value, frozen while Hartwell scrambled to produce the signed compliance documentation that should have existed in February and did not. The documentation could be reconstructed, technically, but reconstructed documentation in the middle of a federal investigation is the kind of thing that makes outside counsel use words like spoliation risk in board presentations. Outside counsel used those words in the board presentation on March 4th. The board had also received, by that point, the formal contract review notice from Meridian Regional Health. $41 million. Suspended new submissions. Independent auditor required. Add the Vantage hold. Add the Meridian suspension. Add the legal fees accumulating since December. Add the revenue gap from the billing cycle that had closed without compliance sign-off. The CFO presented the aggregate number to the board on March 4th. $7.3 million in direct financial impact, with a projected $18.9 million in annual contract value at risk if the Meridian relationship did not stabilize. Richard Ashby called Diane that afternoon. He did not ask for a conversation this time. He said, "What does Miriam need to come back?" Diane called me at 4:30. She said, "Richard Ashby. He's ready to talk terms." I said, "Set the call." The call happened on March 7th. Richard Ashby was on it. The general counsel, a man named Philip Garrett, was on it. Diane was on my end. Trevor was also on it, which I had not expected, and which told me that Richard had insisted on it, probably because he wanted Trevor to hear every word. Richard opened the call. He said, "Miriam, I want to start by saying that the board has reviewed the circumstances of your departure, and we believe the decision was made in error." I said, "I know." He said, "We'd like to discuss bringing you back in a capacity that reflects your actual value to this organization." I said, "I have a list." Philip Garrett said, "We expected you would." I said, "Chief Compliance Officer." "Not Director." "Chief." "Reporting directly to the board, not to the CEO." Richard said, "Understood." Trevor said nothing. I said, "Base salary of $390,000. My previous base was $130,000. This is 3 times that." Philip said, "That's a significant." "Philip," Richard said. Philip stopped. I said, $100,000 signing bonus. And a formal equity participation agreement tied to Hartwell's compliance certification status. If the company maintains clean audit results for 24 consecutive months, I receive a 1.2% equity stake. Diane had helped me build the equity structure. It was the part of the offer I was most proud of, not because of the money, but because it tied my compensation to the outcome I was being hired to produce. That is what alignment looks like. Not a title. Not a bonus. A stake in the result. Richard said, "We can work with that." I said, "Full authority over compliance operations. No executive can override a compliance flag. No billing practice changes without my written sign-off. If the CEO wants to implement a new revenue initiative, it comes to me first." Trevor said, "That's not a standard." Richard said, "Trevor." Trevor stopped. I said, "Marcus Osei returns as Senior Compliance Analyst. His salary increases by 22%. He receives a written acknowledgement from the board documenting his conduct during the transition period." Richard said, "Done." I said, "The Hartwell Compliance Operating System is formally documented as my intellectual contribution to the organization. My name is on it. That does not change regardless of my employment status." Philip said, "We can include that in the agreement." I said, "And a formal incident report, documenting the upcoding pattern, the dates of my memos, the termination decision, the compliance failures during the transition period, and the individuals responsible for each decision. It goes to the board, to legal, and to the permanent operational record." Silence. Trevor said, "That report would be Miriam. That document would have my name in it." "Yes," I said. "That's not something I can agree to." I said, "Then we don't have an agreement." Richard said, "Trevor." Trevor said, "Dad, she's asking for a document that explicitly names me in a federal investigation context. That's not unreasonable." I said, "The SEC already has my memos with your written responses. The incident report documents what the board needs to understand about how this happened so it doesn't happen again. It is not punitive. It is operational." Trevor said, "It will follow me." "Trevor," Richard said. His voice had changed. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that has weight behind it. Trevor stopped. Richard said, "Miriam. The incident report. You have our agreement." I said, "Then I'll start Monday." Diane said, after the call ended, the equity structure was elegant. I said, "Thank you." She said, "The incident report condition was the right call." I said, "I know." She said, "He almost didn't agree." "He agreed," I said. She said, "Because his father made him." "Yes," I said. "That's how accountability works sometimes. Someone with more authority than you decides the record matters more than your comfort." She was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" she said. I thought about it. "Ready," I said. I drove to Hartwell on Monday morning. Same parking garage. Same lobby. Gerald at the security desk. Same morning shift. Same easy manner. He looked up when I came through the door. He said, "Ms. Okafor." I said, "Good morning, Gerald." He reached under the desk and produced a badge. The title read, Chief Compliance Officer. He said, "Mr. Ashby, the senior Mr. Ashby, left this for you personally." I looked at the badge for a moment. Then I clipped it and walked to the elevator. The 4th floor was quiet when I stepped off. It was 7:50 in the morning, early enough that most of the department had not arrived yet. The bullpen was half empty. The lights were on their morning setting, the lower one that the building used before 8. Marcus was at his desk. He was always at his desk early. I had known that about him since his first week. He looked up when I came through. He stood. He said, "Chief Compliance Officer." I said, "Senior Compliance Analyst." He looked at the badge. Then at me. He said, "They gave you the corner office?" I looked down the hallway. The corner office on the 4th floor had been a storage room for 2 years. I had asked for it to be converted in 2020 and been told the budget didn't support it. The door was open. There was a desk in it. There was a window. I said, "Apparently." Marcus said, "Miriam." I looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for putting my name in the terms." I said, "You documented everything while I was gone." "I was just doing my job." "I know," I said. "That's why your name was in the terms." I went to the corner office and sat down at the new desk. The window faced east. The morning light was good. I opened my laptop and started building the Q1 compliance review calendar. 8 months later, Hartwell Group looked different in ways that were structural and similar in ways that were intentional. The Vantage Health payment hold had been resolved in March, 2 weeks after I returned, when I produced the reconstructed compliance documentation through a process that was legally clean, fully disclosed to the pair, and accompanied by a written remediation plan that their audit team accepted without further escalation. The hold was lifted. The $28 million contract was restored. The Meridian Regional Health relationship took longer. Carol Simmons did not restore trust quickly because Carol Simmons was thorough, and thorough people do not restore trust quickly. They restore it correctly. I called her directly in my first week back. I told her what had happened, what I had found, what I had done about it, and what the new compliance structure looked like. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You flagged it in October." "Yes." "And they fired you." "Yes." She said, "And now you're Chief Compliance Officer." "Yes." She said, "Send me the new compliance certification documentation. I'll have our audit team review it." The independent audit completed in May. Meridian Regional Health resumed full billing submissions in June. The $41 million contract was intact. Carol sent me a handwritten note when the certification cleared. It said, "Glad you're back where you belong." I kept it. Marcus had settled into the senior compliance analyst role with the ease of someone who had been doing the work at that level for 2 years without the title. His 22% raise was in his first paycheck. The written acknowledgement from the board was framed, which I had not suggested, but which I found entirely appropriate. He had also, in the 8 months since my return, identified 2 additional billing anomalies in client accounts that had nothing to do with the original upcoding pattern. Both were caught before they became problems. Both were documented, corrected, and reported to the relevant parties. That is what a functioning compliance department looks like. I had also implemented 2 new systems in the 8 months since my return. The first was the Hartwell Compliance Trigger Registry, a documented inventory of every automated process in the compliance framework with named owners, review schedules, and escalation paths. Ryan Cho had not known the Q4 audit trigger existed because it had lived in my institutional memory rather than in a formal registry. That would not happen again. The second was the Executive Billing Review Protocol, which required written compliance sign-off before any new billing methodology could be implemented company-wide. It was the system that would have stopped the revenue acceleration framework before it started. It was the system that should have existed in 2021. It existed now. Trevor Ashby was still at Hartwell. He was no longer CEO. Richard Ashby had not fired him. He had restructured the executive team in April, bringing in an outside CEO named Catherine Voss, who had 20 years of healthcare operations experience and the specific kind of patience that comes from having cleaned up other people's messes before. Trevor had been moved to a role called Chief Strategy Officer, which at Hartwell meant he attended board meetings, contributed to long-range planning discussions, and had no operational authority over billing, compliance, or client relationships. He had no authority over anything that touched my department. The incident report had been completed in April and filed with the board. Trevor's name was in it, as agreed. His written approval of the revenue acceleration framework was in it. My October 14th memo was in it. The timeline was complete and accurate and would remain in Hartwell's permanent operational record for as long as the company existed. He had not spoken to me directly since the March call. I did not require him to. The SEC investigation settled in September. The settlement was $1.1 million in sanctions. Hartwell cooperated fully, which Diane had advised from the beginning and which Catherine Voss had enforced from her first week as CEO. The cooperation reduced the penalty significantly from what it might have been. Trevor was personally named in the investigation as the executive who had approved the billing methodology. He was not criminally charged. He received a formal SEC censure and a 5-year bar from serving as a compliance officer or financial officer at any SEC-regulated entity. He could still be chief strategy officer. He could not touch the numbers. My whistleblower award was calculated at 17% of the $1.1 million settlement. $187,000. Diane called me when the number was confirmed. She said, 17%. I said, yes. She said, how do you feel? I thought about the parking garage. The 3 minutes. The folder on the passenger seat with Section 4, Paragraph 2 highlighted in yellow. I said, like someone who read the fine print. She laughed. It was a good laugh. The total financial cost of Trevor Ashby's revenue acceleration framework, calculated across the full period from Q1 of the fraud through the resolution of the Meridian Regional suspension, was $6.8 million. That included the sanctions, the legal fees, the revenue gap from the Vantage hold, the cost of the independent audit, the premium compensation required to bring me back, and the client recovery expenses. To avoid paying me $130,000 a year to do my job correctly. The math, as I said, was patient. James and I went to dinner on the evening the settlement was confirmed. Not a celebration dinner. Just dinner. The kind we had been having more of since I returned to Hartwell, because the work was in order and the evenings were mine again in a way they had not been for longer than I wanted to admit. He said, how does it feel? All of it. Now that it's done. I thought about it. I said, like the right answer to a problem I've been working on for a long time. He said, that's very you. I said, is that a compliment? He said, it's an observation. I said, I'll take it. He smiled. We finished dinner. I did not check my phone once. I think about Birchwood sometimes. The frosted glass. The cream-colored folder. Colleen's neutral expression. Trevor at the window, looking at Peachtree Street, unable to meet my eyes. The folder was already on the table when I walked in. That detail still matters to me. Not because it was cruel, it was just efficient, the way terminations are when someone has decided the outcome before the meeting starts. But because it told me something important in the first 3 seconds of that room. They had already decided what I was worth. And they were wrong. Not emotionally wrong. Mathematically wrong. Strategically wrong. Wrong in the specific, documented, financially quantifiable way that I had spent 13 years being trained to identify. I had flagged the upcoding pattern on October 14th. I had sent 3 memos. I had saved Diane Castillo's number in February. I had forwarded the documentation to my personal email before anyone thought to ask me not to. None of that was luck. None of it was instinct. It was 13 years of understanding that the work matters, the documentation matters, and the person who keeps the records is never as replaceable as the person who signs the checks believes. They handed me a folder with a Friday deadline and assumed I would sign. I called an attorney from the parking garage. That is the whole story. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, when they hand you a folder and tell you to sign by Friday, the most powerful thing you can do is make a phone call first.